Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. The press is drowning us in whitewater, the latest media firestorm to sweep across American politics. Some call it a feeding frenzy. Others say journalists are just doing a necessary job. Well, are media firestorms changing American politics? And is political coverage getting too personal? Joining us to sort through the conflict and consensus are Judge Robert Bork, who experienced a media feeding frenzy firsthand when he was nominated to the Supreme Court, Professor Lani, whose nomination to a high government post also provoked a media storm, Professor Larry Sabato of the University of Virginia, author of Feeding Frenzy, How Attack Journalism Has Transformed American Politics, and Dr. Suzanne of the American Enterprise Institute and author of Scandal, The Culture of Mistrust in American Politics. Our topic, Firestorm, is the media out of control? This week on Think Tank. American politics has always been a rough and tumble game, and the press has always done much of the pummeling. But something has changed today. On certain kinds of stories, the media seems faster, meaner, more competitive, and addicted to new rules and rituals. Many press barrages deal with alleged unlawful acts committed by public officials, and some focus on personal and moral failings, while others center on bitter differences over policy. What's happening? Well, some trace the rise of attack journalism to the Watergate cover-up in 1974, when the press played a major role in forcing President Nixon to resign.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president at that hour in this office.
That led in the post-Watergate era to politicians who tried to regain the public trust.
I'll never tell a lie. I'll never make a misleading statement.
But Carter himself was tainted later when Burt Lance, director of Carter's Office of Management and Budget, resigned amidst reports of financial wrongdoing. The Iran-Contra hearings offered yet another media fusillade, ending several public careers and launching at least one Senate bid in the state of Virginia. Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas became the focus of the full blast of the media and of the Senate when, during his nomination hearings, he was accused of sexual misconduct, a charge never proved and still in dispute.
This is a circus. It's a national disgrace. And from my standpoint, as a black American, as far as I'm concerned, it is a high-tech lynching for uppity blacks.
And of course, President Clinton himself has not escaped when the press put itself into overdrive. Early on, Zoe Baird, his first nominee for Attorney General, withdrew after the press disclosed that she had not paid Social Security for her child's nanny. And after less than a year and a half in office, there has been Travelgate, Hairgate, Troopergate, and Whitewatergate. The result? It is probably more than mere coincidence that Americans' faith in their government has dropped. In 1964, 78% of Americans said they trusted Washington to do what is right most or all of the time. But by 1994, that number had fallen from 78% to only 20%. Professor Larry Sabato, is the press out of control these days?
Absolutely. Or to put it another way, I'd say the media's excesses are out of control. And they're out of control because of the changes that have taken place in the modern media. It used to be, at least in the modern era, I don't want to go back to the beginning of the American Republic when the media were far worse than they are today, but in the modern era, in the beginning, you had a press driven by the best, driven by those with the highest standards. Today, you have a kind of lowest common denominator journalism.
But what's the difference between a media firestorm and just a big story?
Oh, I think it's this. I guess I do it by defining what a feeding frenzy is, which is what a firestorm is. A feeding frenzy is a critical mass of journalists that leaps in unison to cover a scandalous topic, and almost always does so excessively.
Susie Garment, your book, Scandal, you buy that definition and analysis?
I certainly do. Larry is the expert. Let me add, though, that other things as well have changed in the political community. The rules among politically active people, not just journalists, have become more strict on questions of ethics, for instance. We have much more information available to us about the behavior of public officials.
Have we set up sort of a scandal industry structurally?
You bet. That is, we've not only created professions like the press with the habits of investigation, but we've given them much more material than ever before and many more rules on which to pin stories. So we shouldn't be very surprised.
And some of these are new institutions. I mean, independent prosecutors, independent counsels, new inspector generals. Is that a fairly new development?
Some of these are, in fact, new developments. And there was a whole series of them after Watergate, precisely because we felt confirmed in our mistrust of government, and we wanted plenty of institutions around that were independent and were telling us whatever was wrong, and now we're finding out.
Do you all believe that government today is more corrupt than it used to be?
Oh no, not by a long shot. Government was very corrupt, I think, for a long period of time. I think the corruption now tends not to be about money so much as it tends to be about power and ideology.
I agree with that.
Not
that it's corruption, but that the contest which takes place is really a contest about policy, and yet the way the press often covers it, it becomes a fight over personality.
But one reason for that, of course, is that we have a new politics of moral assault. When people disagree, they don't just disagree, they accuse the other person of being basically evil.
And campaigns have become contests about moral virtue as much as about issues.
Well, but isn't the, we can all do press bashing, I do it myself sometimes, but isn't character, the so-called character issue, isn't that an important issue?
Of course it is, but there are
So
lots
why
of
shouldn't
ways.
they cover it?
But Ben, there are lots of ways to measure character. Do you have to go into the bedroom to measure character?
It depends
or can you,
what's happening in the bedroom.
that may be true, but I think a better way to judge it is by what men and women have done in public life. They've either shown courage or they haven't, for example.
Well, in your excellent book, one of the rules you give for when the private should become public is compulsive sexual behavior.
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can step over the line, and I think compulsive sexual behavior does indeed step over that line, because there are public consequences when you have compulsive sexual behavior.
It also indicates something about a person's mindset and character.
Sure.
The problem is not that character doesn't matter. Character does matter. When we elect a president, certainly, or a senator, we're not just electing a policymaker. We are also electing a role model, and there's no way around that. The problem is that we haven't figured out very well how to measure it properly and make sure that our discussion is relevant to public policy.
Let me play devil's advocate. Don't we need the press to keep that spotlight on the public officials? I mean, isn't that what they're there for?
Yeah, I don't think we're talking about the right thing. It's not when they go into a frenzy, because sometimes they're onto a real story and they go after it all out, and that's fine. What's troublesome is when they begin to report rumors and gossip for which they have no confirmation.
And that happens even on a legitimate story. That's the problem. There are excesses even when the press is onto a legitimate story. They're publishing and airing rumors without sufficient proof. The standard of proof has dropped drastically.
Let's move on from this sort of analytical moment to go briefly to some personal experiences. And again, I want to stress that Lani Guinier and Robert Bork were not accused of doing anything scandalous or even close to it or anything wrong. Nevertheless, they were caught up in a media firestorm as a result of bitter policy differences. And let me just ask you, Lani, starting with you, what's it like to be in that kind of spotlight?
Well, it's very uncomfortable, especially if you don't have an opportunity to respond. In my case, I think my political opponents successfully defined me, and I was under instructions from the administration that nominated me not to respond. And therefore, I had to watch this take place. And in my case, I observed other people talking about someone who was using my name, but it wasn't me. And yet I was not in a position to intervene. And the reporters, unfortunately, were not curious enough to find out whether, in fact, they were describing the real Lani Guinier or someone else's projected caricature of her.
Bob Bork, speaking of caricatures, I wanted to read something here that came about early in the Bork affair by your dear friend Senator Ted Kennedy, and I'll read it quickly, but just to give a little flavor of how tough these things can get. Senator Kennedy said, Robert Bork's America is a land in which women would be forced into back alley abortions, blacks would sit at segregated lunch counters, rogue police could break down citizens' doors in midnight raids, school children could not be taught about evolution, writers and artists could be censored at the whim of government, and the doors of the federal courts would be shut on the fingers of millions of citizens. That's what happened, the day you were nominated?
Yeah, but within 45 minutes of the nomination.
You think he just wrote it out right then, or maybe they were ready?
No, I think they were ready in advance. But no, the interesting thing was there was not a line in that had any resemblance to the truth, but no newspaper or television station, to my knowledge, ever analyzed it to see what relationship that bore to the record. They just reported it. And that was pretty much the way the whole thing went. The accusations were reported. I, like Lani, was under orders not to talk back. And
although, of course, you did get
a hearing, yeah. But that wasn't the kind of...
You got your day in court, as we say.
Yeah, but that wasn't the kind of thing we discussed at the hearing.
Could you not have brought that up?
I suppose I could have brought it up and started a fight about that, yes.
Mm-hmm. But they both received very foolish advice, because one of the best lessons of Watergate is that you must get everything you possibly can out to refute a charge as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. And apparently your media advisors didn't know that.
Well, but the media advisors weren't out to protect the nominees. The media advisors are out to protect the White House and the president.
That's a good point.
And sometimes that's done by separation.
Bob, just personally, what was it like?
Well, it got to the point where I couldn't look at the paper in the morning. I just tell my wife, pass me the sports section. And she then began to have the idea of reading a psalm every morning. And I liked it when she got to the third psalm, which is a plea to God to break the teeth of mine enemies.
Did you ever feel that way about the press when you were going through this?
It was a nightmare, but I continued to read the articles. Mm-hmm. And as I said, even my own mother couldn't recognize me from them. And I subsequently spoke inadvertently to someone who turned out to be a professor of psychology, and I had told him that when I was in high school, my nightmare, my anxiety dream had always been that I would show up the first day of school and not have on my skirt and just have a slip, and all the kids in high school would be pointing at me and laughing. And he said, well, after what I went through, I must be cured now.
Is it possible, in the strange way that fate works out, that these horror shows may have been, in your own cases, for the better? Let me just give you an example. Today, anytime there is a new Supreme Court vacancy, the first guy they want on the panel is Judge Bob Bork, this great, wonderful, learned jurist amongst people who would trash you. You have written a book, a best-selling book describing your legal views. You have a lot of impact on the public debate. Lani Guinier, that trial by fire that you went through, and people said, oh, she's quota queen and it's terrible.
And the Tsarina of Zepratism.
The Tsarina, oh, well, no,
I gave you an opening.
You gave me an opening. I will tell you one paragraph that I wrote about Lani Guinier, which I thought it was one paragraph in a long story, and Lani has been quoting it, the Tsarina of Zepratism. The whole quote, I rather like it, said, Bill Clinton should quietly ask Professor Lani Guinier, alias the quota queen, the princess of proportionalism, the duchess of diversity, the vicar of victimization, the Tsarina of Zepratism, to withdraw her name from Senate confirmation as chief of the Civil Rights Division. What was my question? How did this come up?
You were trying to tell me that I was better off having heard you read that to a national audience for a second time.
Okay, right. But now we see you on the front cover of the New York Times Magazine. You have published a book, which is, I gather, doing very well. There was a big article in the paper there that was at the New York Times the other day that said, Lani Guinier's ideas about cumulative voting, maybe those are pretty good ideas. Are you getting more exposure and more influence for your ideas than you ever would have gotten at the 1, 2, 3, 4th level of the Justice Department.
I don't think you can calculate it that way. Certainly, one of the messages of both my experience and that of Judge Bork is that once the media has martyred you, then they are prepared to give you a hearing. And in that sense, if you take advantage of the opportunity to be heard, you have a platform. But if Judge Bork had been on the Supreme Court, or if I had been given a hearing and been confirmed, then you are in a position not only to talk about some of these ideas, but to do something about them. And I think that we miss the ability of government officials not only to talk about ideas, but actually to talk about them in a context in which there are resources behind them to implement those ideas. If we just trivialize the experience and say, oh, well, now you're a celebrity and you can talk.
No, but I'm not
want.
talking about celebrity status. I am talking about your ability to put forth the serious ideas you wanted put forth. And as we all know, our government is driven by what's in the newspapers and what's on television. And when there's a headline saying, you know, Lani Guinier's idea, those happen to be pretty good. Doesn't that also give you a certain form of influence and power?
Yes, and in some ways what you're describing is the Chinese character for crisis, which is a combination of danger and opportunity. And you're saying, well, look at the opportunity. And I don't deny that it creates an opportunity and that those of us who are in a position to take advantage of it are, in fact, very fortunate.
Until very recently, it was sort of an article of faith in the conservative and in the neoconservative community that this was all a plot by liberals against conservatives. Now we have something called whitewater, which we will talk about in a minute. Is this a bipartisan phenomenon, or are liberals more, are conservatives more likely to get hit than liberals?
For some time during the 1980s, it was a phenomenon of liberals attacking conservatives, partly because conservatives were in power in the executive branch, but during the course of the 1980s, more and more Democrats started to get involved.
Jim Wright was a big one.
That's right. Now on whitewater, there are many conservatives who believe that the press has been soft on Clinton, that the stop-and-go nature of the coverage shows a kind of ambivalence that wouldn't have been there had it been a conservative president. But I don't think it's possible to say that the press has just lain down in front of him. There has been a lot of coverage.
Is this phenomenon going to keep good people from running from office?
I absolutely believe that that's the case. It's impossible to prove, but just consider it from the point of logic. It seems to me that those with the most to lose, those who've spent their whole lives making their friends and family proud of them, achieving a lot in the community, they now recognize that they can have it all thrown away for them with a single headline. One morning's newspaper, one evening news broadcast. Why are they going to run?
All right, let's talk for a minute now about this whitewater situation, because we are again right smack in the midst of a media firestorm. The Clinton people say it's all trivial, nothing's been proved, there is no charge. On the other hand, when you go through the list of some of the things that are at least being talked about, you end up with obstruction of justice, swindle, sexual harassment, cover-up, bribery, lying, illegal commodity trading, illegal campaign financing, and massive philandering. That's just a list that and I'm not saying any of that or all of that is true. Is the press now overreacting to that story, Larry?
I think they're overreacting to the whitewater part of it, the financial dealings part of it. And why is that true? They went to whitewater as a way to avoid Troopergate. To get back to Judge Bork's comment, I think Troopergate is the tip of an iceberg, and there is massive and compulsive sexual activity involved in Clinton's past that probably should have been discussed during the campaign and was not. The press doesn't want to deal with that after Gennifer Flowers, but to avoid looking as though they were in the tank for Clinton, they diverted to whitewater.
Now, you used the word compulsive. You are a professor. You did not use that word by accident, did you?
No, as you can imagine, in investigating those aspects of it for my book, I came across various trails of this, that, and the other myself. So I feel comfortable in using that
Well, could I ask
adjective.
a question? Why do you think the press is disinterested in that particular story if one of the claims is that the press goes after what is most titillating and what is most sensational?
Normally they do, but they were burned badly during the Jennifer Flowers affair. They really got it in the neck during the Jennifer Flowers affair. From, I think, people generally who wanted to focus on broader issues like the economy, certainly from the Clinton people, and of course they have to deal with the Clinton administration, and many of those same campaign aides are now in senior White House positions. So there are a lot of factors at work here.
Well, there's another factor at work, and that is the New Republic writer said that one reason they gave Clinton a break on the sex stories is they like him, they like his policies, and they don't want to bring him down.
That's part of it.
But then why are they going after Whitewater?
Because there it is. Say you don't want to deal with Troopergate, right? Because it's messy and you don't know how you feel about adultery anyway. There, shimmering on the horizon, is Whitewater, a clean scandal, a nice scandal, a scandal fit for a family newspaper.
A Pulitzer Prize scandal.
It's unbeatable.
Does all of this then, I mean, in terms of the way it affects Bill and Hillary Clinton, is this in toto a resurfacing of the character issue? Is that what the sum and substance of this whole argument is about?
It's a resurfacing, but you have to ask yourself why. And the reason why is because the character issue was never resolved during the campaign of '92. The American people wanted to get rid of George Bush. At first they turned to Perot and thought that he would be the alternative. Then they found out he was the political equivalent of a drive-by shooting. And they were left with Bill Clinton. He was the only choice. That was it. And at a certain point, the American people told the press, or maybe the press told themselves, no more information about Bill Clinton because he's the only choice left, and unless we want mass suicides, we need to keep it here. So the questions were unresolved, and they're going to dog him throughout his presidency.
So you are saying that the press made a partisan judgment, that they did not like Bush or Perot, and they purposely laid off an existing story?
No, I believe the American people made that judgment, and the press picked up on it. I think it was the American people every bit as much, if not more so, than the press, who rejected George Bush and decided Clinton was the only real alternative.
Lonnie, do you think the Clintons are being treated fairly by the press in this episode?
Well, I was very persuaded by the piece in the Wall Street Journal by Arthur Schlesinger suggesting that the focus on business deals 15 years ago, which predated the presidency, is a misdirection of the resources of the press, that's something that should be the subject of an election campaign, not the subject of a governing question. But on the other hand, I was also persuaded by Larry's point that if there is a subtext, if there is a concern, a lingering concern that is unresolved, then the press is going to continue to look for opportunities to develop that subtext.
Well, there are two things that should be said about the Whitewater. It's true that it was 10, 15 years ago, but it's also true that it displays characteristics that they denounced in their opponents. The decade of greed.
And it involves things like
hypocrisy.
What they said and did even in the White House.
That's the second part is they're giving a wonderful impression of a cover-up. If it isn't a cover-up, they sure know how to impersonate one.
But one of my concerns, and this is what made me empathetic with Schlesinger's criticism, I think we need to have a focus on the issues. And if the issue is character, let's talk about character. If the issue is health policy, let's talk about that, rather than using these sensationalized stories to personalize policy disagreement and, in a way, do what a Canadian journalist told me, which is to make America a marketplace of emotion rather than a marketplace of ideas.
Can the American people, to use an old phrase, walk and chew gum at the same time? Can we deal with these, whether you agree with them or not, major issues that Bill Clinton has put on the agenda, and at the same time deal with a big-time firestorm scandal?
It's tough, although I think we're starting to do it. It's tough, but the connection between public policy like healthcare and the character issues that are being discussed is one word: trust. And you have to have trust in your leaders that they're telling you the truth about policy. And that goes back to character. And that's why I think we still have all these unresolved questions about the Clintons. And until we resolve them, we're not going to be able to fully focus in on their policy proposals.
But so the unresolved question is what?
The unresolved question is, can we trust Bill Clinton, and is he a good and moral leader?
Well, on that note, thank you, Professors Guinier and Sabato, Dr. Garment, Judge Bork, and thank you for joining us. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.